I'm delighted, obviously not to be back, but to be back at BABCP. I spoke here a couple of years ago, so it's always a really engaging conference. So I'm delighted to share some of our latest findings with you. So over the course of the hour, what I'm hoping to do really is focusing in on this key issue to do with the understanding the transition from thinking about suicide to acting on your thoughts. Now I'll go beyond that, but that'll be something I'll come back to time and again throughout the talk. And then to do that, I'll couch it all in the context of the integrated motivational listening model, which is a model that I've proposed, and then really focusing in on some of the data that we and others have collected to test and investigate some of these questions. And I suppose one of the take-home messages from today will be looking at, hopefully, a better understanding, not just of how suicidal thoughts emerge in some people and not in others, but crucially this, why is it that some people, sadly, too many people, 6,000 people roughly in England and across the UK more broadly, die by suicide each year? What is it that differentiates people who think about suicide to those who attempt suicide and then die by suicide? But hopefully also, I'll focus in on really the basic science today. I'm not really going to focus in on our intervention-based work, but I'm hoping that some of the understandings over the course of the next hour will help us identify key mechanisms which we can then intervene, hopefully to reduce risk. And what I thought I would do slightly differently across the talk today was, it's in 6, oh, my slides have gone a bit AWOL. Those numbers, they should be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. I know I'm Irish, but we can count. But I'm going to begin with a brief history, my brief history in suicide research. I think it's really important that we all recognize that I am standing here as this objective researcher, but of course none of us is objective. And we all bring to our own therapy, our own clinical work, our own scientific work, our own experiences. So what I'm going to highlight are some key things that are key parts of my journey. And this is particularly important to me this year because it's 21 years since I completed my PhD, which I know is so hard to believe. But it is. And then, as you can see, I'm going to then go through the model of suicide and then this transition from thoughts to attempts, and then focus then towards the end on some of the research, ending with a bit on safety planning, which is the one bit I'll talk about in terms of intervention, and hopefully some key conclusions. So where it all began then, this is my sort of journey in suicide research, and these are just the key points which I think are particularly pertinent today. And I'll say something about each of these in a few minutes. But it all began, as I say, many years ago, 45 years ago, in 1973, and there wasn't just one of me, there's two of me. So I have an identical twin brother, who's also a psychologist, a stress researcher, and professor of psychology. And actually what's really interesting for me is being a twin, obviously I don't know what it's like not to be a twin, obviously, but it's been a really important part of my identity, unsurprisingly. And obviously, I think from a very early age, really spurred me on in terms of my thinking around the psychology of individuals and then pursuing a career in psychology. And then we fast forward then, the other key thing was 1997 when I completed my PhD. And actually, what I did a few weeks ago for the first time was, in a long, long time, was actually I went back to my PhD. I dusted it off and looked at the conclusions of my PhD. So my PhD published in 1997. Hold on a second here. That is not the response that was meant to elicit. So the title of my PhD, there's Suicide and Parasuicide Aspects of Identification and Prevention. So it was my first foray into understanding suicide. And I went to the concluding paragraph of my PhD. And the interesting thing, I'll read this through in a second, is I could have written this statement today. So the last paragraph of my PhD. We cannot predict with much accuracy who will attempt suicide or when. Therefore, it is essential that we continue to develop integrated, multivariate psychological, psychosocial, and clinical profiles of at-risk individuals. So it really is startling. You wouldn't have to change one word of that. So although there have been many advances in the 21 years since, there are many, many challenges. And indeed, our ability to predict suicide remains no better than chance. It remains no better than the flipping of a coin. Now, that's not to say that these advances we've made are not important, because they are. And we've developed a lot of our understanding around suicide has developed markedly in the last 20 years, in particular understanding the psychology of suicide, understanding the unique characteristics of suicide, but also understanding the common features, the commonalities around suicide. So although our ability to predict suicide is challenging, hopefully that understanding has given us a more nuanced, a way forward, a way of intervening, a way of treating people with compassion and respect, but also understanding what is going on in an individual who's particularly vulnerable. So that's 1997. We then fast forward to 3 years, and in part to do with my PhD, along with my PhD supervisor, Noel Sheehy, Professor Noel Sheehy, we published the book Understanding Suicidal Behavior. And in that book, that was my sort of first attempt at trying to put together some sort of a psychological understanding to appreciate the complexity of these interacting factors and recognize and trying to go beyond traditional models, trying to go beyond psychiatric explanations of suicide. Indeed, one of the big challenges we have is, albeit that we know that suicide in Western countries more often than not occurs in the context of mental illness, for the overwhelming majority of people with mental illness, mental health problems, whatever your term, they don't die by suicide. And indeed, if we look at mood disorders, which are most commonly associated with suicide, less than 5% of people who are treated for depression kill themselves. So we need to look beyond these traditional risk factors. And again, when I looked at the concluding paragraph of that book from the year 2000, we're still a long way from understanding fully why people kill themselves. So again, not much had happened in the 3 years. So what's interesting from my perspective on reflection is that I suppose I was unaware at the time that a number of years later I would then develop the IMV model, my own model of suicide. But in many respects, my thinking had began then. And when I talk about the IMV model, which was published in 2011, ultimately that's the sort of culmination of my thinking going on, cogitations from 1997 and just before that as we move forward. So let me move on to 2008, and when I started in this field of suicide research, I hadn't been directly affected by suicide. Nobody close to me had died by suicide. But sadly, since that, I've lost 2 important people in my life to suicide. And the first was 2008, a very close friend of mine and colleague who died by suicide in 2008. And that year, I wrote a poem about the year. It was a really unusual year for me. My friend Claire had died by suicide. I had been made full professor. My son was born. So it was a year of mixed emotions. And part of this poem I wrote in 2008 really is dedicated to Claire. And I suppose what's important for me to take from this is, albeit the devastation, I was devastated, continued to be devastated by Claire's death. But it's changed me as a person, and I hope to be a better person, more compassionate, more sensitive, and hopefully more caring. And one of the things, I suppose, which always strikes me is that it's when we look at the people who die by suicide, it's often the people who are the compassionate, the people who are the most sensitive, the people who, when life's challenges really are against them, that they, for whatever set of reasons, cannot respond with life, and sadly for too many people, respond with seeing suicide as the only option for them. And then we fast forward then to 2011, and my next experience of suicide, so the man who, without question, I would not be standing here today, the man who brought me into the field, my first mentor, my PhD supervisor, took his own life. And indeed, this is what I wrote in the dedication to the latest edition of the International Handbook for Suicide Prevention, which I co-edit. And without a shadow of a doubt, I would never, ever have embarked on a career in suicide. I wasn't going to do a PhD on suicide. I was going to do a PhD on the biological aspects of hopelessness and helplessness. Yes, that's related. But it was him came to me and saying, actually, there's a possibility for a scholarship, a PhD looking at suicide. And little did I know that, obviously, sadly, so many years later, that he would no longer be with us. So I think it's really important to be acknowledged, and I think it's important to me to acknowledge what I'm bringing to what I'm trying to do in the work that I'm going to talk about for the remainder of the talk. So what that brings us then is if we look at the broad brush of attempts to understand suicide. This is just one of the slides from the World Health Organization Suicide Prevention Report, published a few years ago. But the sad reality of, although suicide prevention has now increased in importance, political importance in Western countries and around the world, The first ever suicide prevention report, World Suicide Prevention Report, commissioned by the World Health Organization, was published in 2014. And that just really, I think, illustrates that, yes, we've been trying to study suicide for many, many years, but the recognition of it as a real worldwide public health problem, as indexed by the publication of the report, is pretty recent. And what I'm going to focus in on are really, in essence, part 2 of this for the purposes of today's talk, understanding better identification of risk factors and prevention and protective factors. So we're all well aware in this room of the complexity around suicide and the factors, the broad range of factors that lead to both self-harm and suicidal behavior. And this is a sort of pathway model Keith Houghton, Kate Saunders and I put together a few years ago, which was for adolescent suicide and self-harm. But this diagram is applicable across the lifespan. But all I really want to take from this slide is the recognition, yes, that suicide historically has been within the domain of psychiatric illness, and indeed that's recognized here, but we need to look beyond that. And this is really just an illustration of the biological, psychological, clinical, cultural, and other factors associated with suicide. And I suppose what we're going to do, or what we've been doing over the last few years, is focused in on this bit. We're trying to understand the emergence of psychological distress that for some people has suicidal overtones or undertones. Because we know that if in one depressive episode or one episode of distress an individual associates that with suicidal thoughts, we know that the next time there's an episode of depression, the next time there's an episode or experience of distress, that the likelihood of suicidal thoughts being emerging again is elevated. And indeed the threshold in which suicidal thoughts emerge next time gets lower and lower. And so I'm really going to focus in on that, the work we've been doing to try and understand the emergence of suicidal thoughts, and then that transition from thoughts to attempts. I was looking back on the slides I presented at the BABCP 2 years ago, and I included this slide last time, and it's an important slide to illustrate not only the scale of the challenge, so 800,000 people die by suicide each year, 6,000 in the UK, but behind every one of those statistics is an unbearable tragedy. And over the years, I get sent suicide notes from loved ones and family members in the hope that the suicide note of their loved one could help us in some particular way to get an insight into the window of somebody, often in the minutes before death. So this is a suicide note of a man who's sadly no longer with us. If you're reading this, I've had enough and I'm dead. You can see how bollocks my life is. I can't think of any day when things have gone well recently, and who really cares about me anyway? I'm a failure, can do nothing right, useless and trapped. With my girlfriend, I was really happy for once in my life. I tried my hardest with her, and I was shit, and I still failed. What did she want? I didn't know what to do. What did she want? I didn't know what to do. And I've read this countless times, and obviously it gets me every time. And what I often say when I read this suicide, what often comes into my head is the everydayness of suicide. Because I remember growing up and thinking about people who kill themselves are different from me. They're qualitatively different from me, because I would never kill myself. And what we certainly know is that suicide can affect any one of us. And that note illustrates that, I think, quite nicely. And in addition to that, this notion of entrapment I'll return to time and time again, because indeed that's what we focus in on in my model of suicide. So that brings us on then to the IMV model, the Integrated Motivational Volitional Model, which I first published in 2011, and actually just this week we've published a refinement to the model, an updated version in the Philosophical Transactions of the Royal Society, which is open access on our website or on the journal's website. And I've also uploaded a podcast outlining the updates. So I'll highlight some of the key points in a second. But this was my attempt in 2011 to try and understand or put together what we thought was our best guess, our best evidence, and integrate the existing sort of theoretical knowledge around why people kill themselves. And it brings together a whole range of different theoretical perspectives, including Mark Williams' work on the cry of pain, broad diathesis stress perspectives, the theory of planned behavior, a whole range of other things which I try to funnel in terms of my development of the model. And it was particularly pertinent then in 2011 it was published, because obviously that was the year my mentor killed himself. And then thinking back that in 2000 was my first attempt with him to put together our understanding of the psychology of suicide. So I'm just only going to give you a sort of brief overview of the model, which sets a scene for the remainder of the empirical work I will talk about thereafter. So it's a three-part model, a tripartite model. So on the left-hand side, we've got the pre-motivational phase. And what that is, in essence, is the biopsychosocial, the biosocial context in which suicidality, suicidal thoughts and attempts may emerge. So there's nothing particularly new there in the sense that we've got a vulnerability component, so diathesis. And that can be biological vulnerability, or it could be personality, individual differences type vulnerability factors. You've also got environmental influences. We know that suicide more often than not, occurs in the context of disadvantage. So if you lived in this country, in Scotland, if you live in the most affluent parts of Scotland, and I look at the suicide rates of the most affluent, live in the most affluent areas, and compare that to those who are most disadvantaged, living in the most disadvantaged areas, the difference in risk is tenfold. Tenfold difference in risk. Hugely important. If we could tackle inequality properly, we would really go some distance in tackling the suicide problem. And then negative life events. Negative life events could be early life trauma, as well as negative life events throughout your life course. And we know that people who attempt suicide, people who die by suicide, experience a disproportionate number of negative life events compared to those who don't die by suicide. But I think the bit which is particularly interesting for my purposes is the central and the third phase. So the central phase is the motivational phase. And that's really what that's trying to do, is understand the emergence of suicidal thoughts, which is that central core of the model, which is the motivational phase. And then the third phase, the right-hand phase, is the volitional phase. It's trying to understand this transition from thinking to attempting, from thinking to acting on your thoughts. And in a very parsimonious way, defeat and entrapment are at the core. So in a very parsimonious way, the argument would be that people who experience feelings of defeat and or humiliation from which they cannot escape, the sense of unbearable entrapment, increases the likelihood that they'll experience suicidal thoughts. Okay, so it's in this sense, a linear pathway going from defeat and humiliation to entrapment. Then entrapment increases the likelihood that suicidal thinking will emerge. And then the factors below that, the threat to self-moderators and motivational moderators, are other psychological factors which facilitate this transition from left to right, this transition from having thoughts of suicide or being defeated through to entrapment to suicidal thoughts. But the crucial bit for the purposes of today in understanding the transition from thinking to attempting suicide is this bit here. In sort of health psychology, I'm a health psychologist, and we often talk about the intention-behavior gap. Or if you look at public health interventions, the public health intervention might be to get people to stop smoking. And you try and increase somebody's intention to stop smoking, and then you intervene, and then see whether they have made that transition to stopping smoking. And usually in public health, we're trying to make that bridge, basically make it as solid as possible. Make sure as many people who intend to give up smoking actually do. We're trying to do the opposite in suicide prevention. We're trying to understand the factors that lead to suicidal thoughts, but I want to make that bridge as wide as possible. I want to blow the bridge up. I want to do whatever you do with bridges, right, which stops them working. I want that to happen so that fewer and fewer people make that transition from thinking to attempting suicide. And that's really what I'm going to focus on for the next phase of the talk. And in terms of the updates to the model from 2011 to 2018, there's two major things to highlight. So the first is we've included this here, these arrows to represent the cyclical nature of suicidal thinking and suicide attempts. So albeit the model here is written as a linear model, it's important to recognize that suicidality, as we well know, it waxes and wanes. Suicidal thoughts come and go. Many people have suicidal thoughts, then attempt suicide, and go back to having suicidal thoughts. And it's recognizing that complexity. And then the second thing we did in the major update in 2018 was we provided a more detailed exposition of the factors or the pillars which govern the transition from thinking to attempting suicide. So I'll outline 8 key volitional phase factors, or volitional moderators, which are here, which we think the presence of these increase the likelihood, if you think about suicide, that you'll act on your thoughts and attempt suicide or die by suicide. So I'm going to move on to that now. But before I do give the details of the volitional phase factors, some evidence to support the utility of the central components of the model. So this is a study from a few years ago, and what we've done here is we have recruited people, usually within many of our clinical studies, people are recruited within 24 hours of a suicide attempt. And we assess them on a range of factors, as you can see here, and then we try to see, can we predict repeat suicidal behavior, or sadly death by suicide over the next 4 years in this study. And what this slide illustrates in each of these factors, higher levels of depression, higher entrapment, higher hopelessness and so on, was associated with a statistically increased likelihood that the individuals over the next 4 years were hospitalized again for a self-harm episode or died by suicide. But crucially, when we asked which factors were most important, two emerged: past behavior, which I can't change, and levels of entrapment assessed in the emergency department. Those levels of entrapment predicted your likelihood of being hospitalized again in the next 4 years. And indeed, there's other work then which has supported the centrality of defeating entrapment. So there's a couple of slides here. This is a study from one of my colleagues, Karen Wellerall. And we just, nice evidence of the pathway from feeling defeated to becoming trapped, and from trapped to developing suicidal thoughts. Another study from Rebecca Owens at Manchester with individuals with bipolar disorder. Again, more evidence to support this pathway. So there's a growing body of evidence of highlighting the centrality of entrapment in the suicidal process. And crucially, I would argue that that should be a key component of any risk and psychosocial assessment, that we should be trying to target entrapment, and because we know it waxes and wanes as well. We know it increases and decreases. So it could give us some indication when individuals are at particularly high risk. And indeed, there's been a structural test of the model, and again, this just highlights this pathway from defeat to entrapment to suicidal ideation to suicide attempts. Okay, so that's just really focusing in on the importance of defeat and entrapment within the suicidal process, these key core, sort of the backbone of the IMV model. What I want to move on to now is this transition going from thoughts to attempts. So again, I'm going to present a series of studies which we have conducted and others have conducted to try and tackle this key question of understanding thinking to attempts. In terms of understanding thinking to attempts, one of the things we need to bear in mind is that if we're trying to understand the things that lead to suicidal thoughts, we have to bear in mind that there are a range of other factors associated with the development of thoughts of suicide. So I've gone ahead of myself there. I forgot these slides were here. So I'm trying to backtrack without anybody noticing that I'm not going to talk about thoughts to attempts for 3 slides. So just forget I said the stuff about we're going direct to thoughts to attempts. So I think it's important in this audience to highlight the importance of relatively stable personality dimension, which is social perfectionism, which is trying to understand basically the beliefs that some of us have, often excessive beliefs about what we think others expect of us. So individuals who have high levels of social perfectionism, in all of the studies we've done countless studies with thousands of people, young people, old people, clinical populations, healthy populations, and people who report high levels of perfectionism are at increased risk of suicidal thoughts and behavior. But crucially, the reason we think it's important is we think people with high levels of social perfectionism are much more likely to be affected by negative life events. So we think they're much more sensitive to negative signals in the environment. And so we've looked at this in, as I say, a range of studies. And this is just a slide from one of our studies with adolescent young people, with 15 and 16-year-olds. And what we came up with here was what we described as the stress threshold lowering effect. And what we found was that individuals who report high levels of social perfectionism, they're much more likely to repeat self-harm in this adolescent population, but you can't differentiate them in terms of negative life events. So what we found was that if you had 2 people who experienced low levels of negative life events, right, the people who are low in social perfectionism were less likely, were not increased risk of self-harming. But even if you reported low levels of negative life events and you had high social perfectionism, you're much more likely to self-harm. Because what we think is going on is that people with high levels of social perfectionism are much more sensitive to these signals of failure and defeat in the environment. And indeed, I'd recommend that people read, if you're interested, to know more about the whole notion of social perfectionism, I'd really recommend Will Storr's book called The Selfie, and he tracks not just everyday life, but he's tracked from the pre-Christian times right forward to modern day, and looking at this broad concept of social perfectionism. And there's really free access mosaic science piece looking at male suicide, which he focuses in on social perfectionism and interviews me as part of it. Okay, right, so got a bit ahead of myself there, so we're now going back to the transition. So I think one of the biggest questions we have as a field is to better understand that transition, because thousands upon thousands of people have thoughts of suicide, and most people don't make that transition to acting on their thoughts. And as I say, the update in the IMV model was we basically outlined what we argued are 8 pillars of this transition from thinking about suicide to attempting suicide. So 8 volitional factors. And the presence of these, the argument is, the presence of these increases the likelihood that you move from thoughts, suicidal ideation, to suicide attempts. And many of these are not brand new in terms of they're well known in the literature, but some of them are newer. And what we try to do is bring them together into a meaningful framework. So the first one, access to the means of suicide. We've known for a long time that if you have suicidal thoughts and you have access to the means of suicide, you're much more likely to act on your thoughts. So it's not rocket science. Second, planning. We know the extent to which an individual has planned their suicide attempt makes it much more likely they'll act on their thoughts. And we've done work on what are known as if-then plans, to trying to get people to identify the critical situations in which they're tempted to self-harm or thinking about self-harm, and instead of them then responding with self-harm, we want them to respond differently and try and not self-harm in the future. So we need to look at, has an individual formulated a plan, and then can we keep the person safe? Third, one of the factors which has really become so powerful as a predictor of future suicidal behavior is exposure to suicide or suicidal behavior of others. We know that a whole range of studies, both for suicide, for what's described as non-suicidal self-harm, from suicide attempts, individuals who are exposed, having a family member or a close friend who's died by suicide or engaged in suicidal behavior, your individual risk has increased. Next, impulsivity. Now, the relationship between impulsivity and suicide risk is complicated, but we know certainly for at least a subgroup of individuals that high levels of impulsivity increase the likelihood that you act on your thoughts of suicide. Next, the next 2 are combined are Thomas Joyner's idea of acquired capability, having the capacity to kill yourself. And so they're two factors, physical pain tolerance, physical pain sensitivity. So the hunch here is the idea is that people who die by suicide, who make serious suicide attempts, have higher physical capacity to withstand the pain required, sadly, to undertake a suicidal act. And then the next is fearlessness about death. And again, fearlessness about death is something which we would argue you should be routinely assessing. It's this idea of the individual has to overcome their life instinct to actually kill themselves. So you can assess now how the fearlessness about death can change over time. And the argument is high levels of fearlessness, much more likely to act on your thoughts. And then the second last one is mental imagery. And we've been doing a lot of work recently on looking at how people imagine themselves as dying or dead. And people who report higher levels of mental imagery around death and about suicide are much more likely to act on their thoughts of suicide. Last, past suicidal behavior. The single best predictor of future behavior is past behavior. Suicide is first and foremost a behavior. It's not an epiphenomenon of mental illness or mental ill health. It's a behavior in and of itself, and the best predictor of future behavior is past behavior. It remains the case. So the argument, these 8 pillars, the argument is higher levels of these, much more likely to act on your thoughts of suicide. Okay, so that's outlined the key volitional phase factors. So what I want to do now is give you some data on these. And while I'm getting some data, has anyone got tissue? Because the heat up here with this light. Has anyone got tissue I can get? So I'm going to focus, while we're waiting for the tissue, a tissue break. Nobody's got see, thank you very much. What was that? People throwing tissues at me. See, people who are recording this video didn't anticipate this. So this light, the heat here is just remarkable. Does anybody want to come down and check the light? Okay, so in terms of the data, so what we're going to focus on now is a series of studies, different types of studies, so epidemiological type studies as well as experimental studies to unpick this key question of thinking to attempts. So this study from a few years ago led by Katie Dingra, and again we've recruited people, we've just allocated them into 3 groups based on their suicidal history as is outlined here, and then they complete a range of measures which are basically assessing the motivational phase and the volitional phase of the model. Remember, the key argument here is the volitional phase factors, which are the ones which are governing the transition from thinking to attempting suicide. So the argument is when you do a multivariate model, the volitional phase factors are most important in differentiating those who ideate from those who attempt suicide. As you'll see in a second, that's exactly what we find when we do the analysis. So what we found then, we just did a multivariate analysis, a multinomial logistic regression. These are just the factors, and as we would predict, no difference between the ideation group and the attempt group on our key motivational phase. So it's not the people who attempt suicide are more defeated or more entrapped. That's not differentiating them in a multivariate model. What's important is the people who attempt suicide significantly more impulsive, significantly more exposure, both friends and family, to suicide of others. Significantly less fearful about dying, crucial one. Significantly less fearful. And the only one which didn't differentiate, which is discomfort tolerance. And what discomfort tolerance is completing a questionnaire in which we ask you how much physical pain you can withstand. Now, I don't know about you, but I would find that really difficult to answer. And indeed, we're moving away from these self-report measures of physical pain sensitivity to experimental-based measures of actually recording actual physical pain tolerance. So that's one study. We've just completed a study in Scotland, the Scottish Wellbeing Study, which is large-scale, the largest ever study of its kind in young people in Scotland, looking at well-being, including suicide and self-harm, or thoughts of suicide and self-harm, and a whole range of other factors. And again, we can do the exact same thing. We can compare our 3 groups in exactly the same way as we've done in the previous study. So we've got 3,500 people, representative sample. So the people who attempt suicide unsurprisingly, they tended to be older, and they tended to be more often female. And again, that's not surprising. That's consistent with what you find in epidemiological studies. But no difference in the other measures. No difference in defeat, no difference in entrapment, burdensomeness, belongingness, and so on. No difference in the key factors which are important in the emergence of suicidal thinking, but do not govern. They're not key to governing the transition from thinking to attempting suicide. But the volitional phase factors, significantly more impulsive, those individuals who had attempted suicide. Significantly higher levels of acquired capability, this fearlessness plus pain sensitivity. Significant more imagery about death. And significantly more exposure to the suicide attempts of friends. Now, what was interesting in this study, there was no difference between those who thought about suicide and those who attempted suicide in terms of exposure to suicide attempts of family. Now, that might represent the fact that we know as people move from, obviously, into adolescence and young adulthood, that your friends have a much more powerful impact. Their behavior may have a more powerful impact on you than your family have. And we need to explore that in more detail, because it's similar, there was no difference in suicide attempt exposure or suicide death exposure. So again, that's more data, another 3,500 people there. And then another study, not focusing on suicide attempts specifically, but looking at adolescents who self-harm. We did exactly the same thing with a large sample of young people, 15 and 16-year-olds in Scotland and Northern Ireland. And again, the same idea, exposure being key, impulsivity being key, and differentiating people who think about self-harm and those who actually self-harm. More recently still, another large sample led by Becky Mars, this time almost 5,000 people from the ALSPAC, the cohort study in the Bristol area. And again, the same finding when we compare people who've attempted suicide from people who think about suicide. Exposure is key again. In this study, there wasn't a wide range of variables that tested my model, but the key factors are still there. So that's data from thousands of young people, primarily, young adults, adolescents, and so on, supporting this broad idea that these volitional phase factors are key differentiators between thoughts and action. So what I want to move on to now then is not move away from the sort of epidemiological type work and focus in on some of the experimental work that we do. And this is work on looking at cortisol, the stress hormone, and the stress response. And there's a long history of looking at cortisol in psychopathology, mental health problems more generally. And there's a relatively small literature looking at it in the context of suicide and self-harm. But it's important because we know that's what the fight-or-flight response. We need cortisol released, so when the next time we encounter stressful life events, stressful times, that our body is physiologically prepared. It's physiologically prepared to respond. We know that cortisol is associated with good decision-making. It's associated with emotional processing. Things which we know are key are ingrained in understanding the suicidal process. But the idea is that this notion of what's described here is allostatic load. So if you're repeatedly stressing the body, people who are suicidal repeatedly experience stressors. Their bodies repeatedly been put under strain. And for people, our hunch is for people who attempt suicide compared to people who just think about it, we bet that their stress system is broken down as well. So not only are they feeling entrapped and defeated, psychologically overwhelmed, but the physiological, the body is also overwhelmed, and the body is not preparing the individuals to be in a position to respond the next time they encounter stress. So we looked at this in the study, and this is published last year, comparing people who think about suicide from people who attempt suicide. And again, this is with my twin brother who featured earlier. So Darrell, as I said, is a stress researcher at the University of Leeds, and this is obviously planning the study. But the thing which I think is, I don't really care whether you care about the slide. I like seeing the pictures, right? So, but what is really noteworthy is, look at those knees. My knees are wider than almost wider than my waist. I showed my kids, and my kids were just horrified at this because they've got proper knees. Anyway, so this work led by Darrell and in conjunction with other colleagues throughout the country. So what we did in this study, looking at the stress response, is we want to mimic this in the laboratory. So what we try and do then is we develop an intervention which we know activates a cortisol system, which activates a stress response. And our hunch is that people who attempt suicide, their stress system is not working as effectively in the people who attempt suicide compared to people who think about it, compared to the people with no history. And the idea is that people who have attempted suicide, that the stress system has just broken down, it's dysregulated. So we recruit people and bring them into the lab, and what we do is we have to activate the stress system using an intervention. So what we do, as you can see here, just summarizes the study. But we just do a sort of clinical history initially. And then the key thing is we do some measurements, including cortisol. And we're assessing cortisol throughout using saliva. So salivary cortisol is recorded throughout the study. And then there's the MAST. And the MAST is the Maastricht Acute Stress Test, which is a combination of the cold pressure task, which is when you have to put your hand in cold water for a period of time. We know it activates the HPA axis, it releases cortisol. And then you have to do this thing, which is you have to count back, starting from 2043. You have to count back in 17s. You think you're being recorded, and if you get it wrong, back to the start, right? Sounds awful, but it's completely informed consent, and what we know it does, crucially, is it activates the HPA axis. It activates the cortisol system. It's a really good way of trying to tap into, is the cortisol system working? There's no adverse effects. It's just a short-lived thing. And throughout, we're assessing your cortisol, your release of cortisol. And our hypothesis here is we've got our three groups, the control group, people who think about suicide, and people who attempt suicide. And our idea is that when we give the stress intervention, that the people who attempt suicide will release the least cortisol, okay? So it's what's known as a blunted response. As you'll see in a second, that's exactly what we found. This is a summary of it. This is a nice picture of it. And that's exactly what we find. So what we've got here is we've got our three groups, as you can see labeled. And we've got cortisol has been released. That's when the stress test is happening. And the people who attempt suicide are releasing significantly less cortisol than the others. Okay? So not only are these individuals overwhelmed psychologically, there's evidence here of this blunted effect. But it's not just, if we just focus in on the people who've attempted suicide and look at when they attempted suicide, what we find is where most of the bluntedness is in the individuals who had attempted suicide less than 12 months ago. So in a way, there's a good news in that, which is what it suggests is that the body recovers beyond the 12 months. Now, it never recovers back to the level of a control individual or somebody who thinks about suicide, but there's some recovery of the stress system. So what we need to be doing are developing interventions to make that stress system recover quicker and more effectively. We then look at not just the individual's suicide attempt history, but whether they had a first-degree relative who died by suicide. We see this combination of genetic vulnerability plus your own individual vulnerability. And what we see here, these represent people who have attempted suicide and a family history of a first-degree relative. Almost flat response. So what it illustrates the challenge we have, we're trying to move forward in terms of developing interventions, because people carry vulnerability with them. And it's a recognition of that vulnerability which is important, so we could then intervene. So that's, I think, good evidence from an experimental study in the laboratory that these individuals' response in terms of the cortisol system is different than people who've attempted suicide. And indeed, we followed these individuals over the next 1 month and 6 months later. And their cortisol response in the laboratory predicted how suicidal they were 1 month later. So it's not just in the laboratory, it's carrying risk with them, certainly in the short term. We asked the question, well, what could be contributing to your experience of this depleted cortisol response? And we looked at childhood trauma. And we just compare our 3 groups on established measures of childhood trauma. No surprise, the people who attempt suicide have significantly more childhood trauma than people who think about suicide from control groups. Marked differences. But crucially, though, we asked ourselves, are people's response in terms of their childhood trauma? Remember, the average age of this sample is about 30. They're reporting childhood trauma which happened maybe 20 years ago. And what you'll see in a second is their experience of childhood trauma 20 plus years ago predicts their cortisol levels in the laboratory when we saw them. And that's what the next slide illustrates. This illustrates individuals who had high exposure to high exposure to trauma, that we can see that there predicts the flattened cortisol response. So we can see then that as one potential mechanism which is increasing the likelihood that suicide risk carries with us over time. Okay, so that's the cortisol stuff. A recent study from Glasgow, this is data from Glasgow, we've just compared people looking at childhood trauma, the ACEs, which is a standard measure of ACEs, and people who had first episode self-harm versus repeatedly self-harming. And your risk of repeatedly self-harming was almost twice as high if you had experienced 4 or more ACEs. So again, we know this from the literature. These are just local data supporting the really debilitating effects of childhood trauma, not just in the here and now, but over time. Okay, so that's all I'm going to say about childhood trauma and the cortisol system. We're coming towards the end. I want to focus in on some new work we've been doing, looking at a very different way of thinking about suicide risk. So almost everything I've talked about in terms of defeat and entrapment, they're all things in terms of the processes, the dual processes of behavior, are reflective systems. So if you read Daniel Kahneman's work, he talks about having 2 interacting systems which predict all behavior. The reflective system and then the automatic system. And the reflective system is when we ask people, what are your attitudes towards this or that? Or we ask people, how defeated do you feel? Or how trapped do you feel? That's a reflective process. The automatic system is actually, which we know is really powerful in governing behavior, is these automatic responses, these automatic attitudes we have towards, in this case, as you'll see in a second, towards death, which I can't measure in the laboratory. I can't ask you, you're not aware of in a self-report way about your attitude towards death necessarily, but I can look at it in an experimental way, as you'll see in a second, using implicit attitudes, because we know that they're really, really key. And indeed, the suicide prevention field has largely ignored the system too, these automatic responses. So the last sort of major study we talk about is one it's just in press in Journal of Abnormal Psychology, which looks at implicit attitudes towards death and suicidal thoughts. The implicit attitudes, and this is a bit of a messy slide, but the key points from this are, so Matt Nock at Harvard has modified the existing, what is known as the implicit attitudes test. And what the implicit attitudes test asks you to do, it asks you to basically categorize words in terms of to what extent they're in particular groups and how they relate to you or not to you. And he modified it for the context of death and suicide, to try and tap into this implicit process, these automatic processes about your implicit attitude towards death and life. And you get what's known as a D score. And he showed in a seminal study in 2010 that people's response in this task, and I'll show you the task in a second, people's response predicted repeat suicidal behavior in adolescents beyond clinical judgment, the individual's self-report of whether they'll attempt suicide again in the future, and a range of other measures. So we're not saying this is a solution to intervening or assessing suicide risk, but it could be another tool in our toolkit. But in this study we did with Matt, you shall see in a second, we did this study, exact same study in Glasgow, was Christine Cha, who led it in Harvard. We did exactly the same thing. We ran it in parallel in both our cities. And this is just an illustration of the task. And you can just see here we've got a range of words, categories of death, life, me, and not me. And there's a whole range of trials that people have to complete in the lab. And we get people to categorize the word, the target word, as you can see here, die is a target word, in terms of the extent to which it relates, you think it relates to death or life, and how it relates to you or not you. And over a whole range of trials, you get this score, and this score basically we think is an implicit attitude of the strength of association to life or death. Okay? And what we did was, we asked it 3 simple questions in this study. So we wanted to know not only about how strongly you're identified with life or death, but crucially, what happens when you're in a low mood. We know that suicide usually happens in the context of low mood or high levels of stress. So what we did in this study, we basically induced negative mood briefly in the laboratory with people with different suicidal histories. And our hunch was that the people who had thought about suicide previously, what's known as a differential activation hypothesis, the idea that if I put you in a low mood, you're much more likely to have suicidal thoughts emerge, much more likely to be catastrophic cognitions. And our idea was, we bet, if we induce negative mood in people with a suicidal history, and we look at their implicit attitudes towards life and death, in that low mood situation, that will be really, really powerful in the people who had previously thought about suicide, and that will actually predict how suicidal they are over time, and become clear in a second. So that's the sort of three quick key questions which are summarized on that slide. So we 260 odd people, and as I said already, we recruited them both in Scotland and in the Boston area. And we have 2 groups, as you can see. People with a suicidal ideation history had thought seriously about suicide in the last 12 months, compared to people who hadn't, so there are no suicidal history. And this is again a broad idea, sort of summary of the design of the study. So the key point here, though, is we do computer tasks with people. We assess people's implicit attitudes before a negative mood induction. We then do a negative mood induction, which is a well-established measure in which we get people to listen to sad music and to think about negative self-statements about themselves, obviously. And then we reassess the IAT, the implicit attitudes task, and then we do a positive mood induction, so people leave the laboratory in the same state in which they arrived, and then we follow these individuals over the next 1 and 6 months. And the summary is, what we found was evidence of the importance of this implicit measure of attitudes towards death. So I'll just highlight the key findings because this slide's a bit tricky to illustrate. But what this slide summarizes is that the individuals who had a previous suicidal history, that their identification with life was much weaker than people with no suicidal history, but crucially, it got worse. It got worse after the negative mood induction. So the point here is it's a nice illustration of how when somebody's in a negative mood, something we can't ask somebody about, but their body, again, implicitly is responding, in this case, with a much more negative sort of automatic response, in this case, less identifying with life. So we think it could be a potential facilitator for moving from thoughts to attempts, but we haven't looked at that in this case. And indeed, when we look over time, their scores in that task, controlling for a range of other factors, also predicted suicidal ideation 1 month later and 6 months later. And that's just summarized here. And that's controlling for baseline clinical factors and baseline suicidal ideation. So it's predicting changes, residual change in suicidal thoughts. Okay, so that's all I want to say about the sort of main sort of body of the talk. What I try to illustrate with, I've got one more study to talk about. It's a study in progress, but it's a different study indeed. But what I try to illustrate with these slides is the different ways in which we're trying to understand the suicidal process. We're trying to look at it not just in an epidemiological, reflective way, but looking at implicit processes, looking at the body's physiological response, because suicide will never have, if we just focus on one type of factor, we're never going to get anywhere. We need to look at these combination of factors. But what I want to finish with is an ongoing project which is funded by MQ Research, which is focusing in on an aspect of the volitional phase. So the volitional phase, part of it is to do with planning. And so there's a lot of clinical work about safety planning. So getting an individual there's a standard way in which we get people to identify warning signs, triggers for when they become suicidal, and then to identify internal coping responses, as well as people they could speak to in times of crisis, as well as professionals, and also keeping your environment safe, trying to restrict access to means of suicide. But there's no RCT published yet on safety planning and whether it's effective in reducing future suicidal behavior. This week, Barbara Stanley and colleagues, and Greg Brown and colleagues published a cohort study with veterans in the United States, which looked really, really positive. It looks like there's a 40% reduction in hospitals in which there's safety planning. Safety planning, crucially, also with telephone support, with up to 4 weeks of telephone support after people leave the emergency department. So our funding from MQ is actually to see, can we use safety planning in the UK context? And what we're doing in our ongoing study is we have a 3-phase study, which we're now in phase 3 of the study. So what we've done is we've tailored the sort of US measures of safety planning and how you would deliver telephone support. So what we get in our study is people complete the safety plan in hospital, and then they're offered within 72 hours, one of our team will phone them, the risk assessment and a sort of mood check, and to update the safety plan as required. And they're offered then up to 4 weeks, 5 telephone calls over the next 4 weeks. And what we're doing is we're doing it across 4 hospitals in Scotland. We're in phase 3 of this feasibility trial. And what we're hoping to do is, it's not powered to detect an effect. We're looking to see, is there sufficient evidence or signals in the data to suggest this may be useful in a UK context. And so this will be the first study of its kind conducted in the world, and say Barbara's involved in it as well. And we're hoping that will form the basis then for a full RCT. Because to date, we still don't know well safety planning, one of these volitional phases, about keeping people safe in the moments of crisis, making it less likely they'd make that transition from thinking about suicide to attempting suicide. So fingers crossed we get some positive news from that. Okay, to bring it together, what I've tried to illustrate is, yes, the importance of the complexity, but I think suicide is ultimately a psychological phenomenon because an individual makes a decision to kill themselves. That's not saying they have a choice, but it's a decision, it's a behavior. An individual is affected by a whole range of factors, their past, their present, and obviously what they think about the future, their biology, their history of trauma and negative life events, their attachment relationships, their culture. These factors all come together, but how they come together is the impact on the way an individual views their future. And in the constricted vision of the person who's suicidal, they can't see alternatives, and suicide is the only alternative, sadly, for them. What I've tried to highlight is the importance of looking at theoretical models, and there's a key question between thinking about suicide and attempting suicide. I think it's a big, big challenge. And that focusing on these theoretical models can hopefully inform the development of interventions. So one of the reasons I would argue that we've been so poor as a field at developing effective interventions is because we've been too quick to jump to the intervention without doing the basic science research or understanding what might be the mechanisms. What are we targeting here? Now, the good news is, in the last 20 years, the evidence base for CBT, DBT, ACT, all the CTs, is growing. But we don't know what components of any of those letters is effective. We don't know what the active ingredients are, and that's something we really need to move forward on. And then the last thing in terms of the summary is that what we think about when we're thinking about interventions, there are at least 2 types of interventions. So all the ACT, BCT is one in health psychology. Anyway, but it's not therapy, it's a technique, it doesn't matter, right? But that's targeting the emergence of suicidal thinking. So cognitive behavioral therapy is looking at what are the complex factors that lead to the emergence of suicidal thinking. But we should never forget about the volitional phase interventions, the ones which are targeting the intention to behavior gap, the ones which are making it less likely that the next time an individual becomes suicidal, hopefully they don't act on their thoughts, and we can help work with them in a collaborative way to keep themselves safe. So just to finish then, I want to again go back to the words of somebody else, and this is another suicide note. And I gave a talk to the National Suicide Prevention Alliance in January in London, and after the talk, the mother of a lady who took her own life sent me this note about her daughter who took her own life. And again, it's just an incredible read. I'm sorry, so sorry. I've always wanted to die. I always knew my life would be a dreary failure. Inside, I've been dead and dry for a long time now. I've not taken joy from anything. Well, enough is enough. A slave can't feel anything but pain. And now the physical pain has destroyed even the most passing of happiness. I'm scared and I'm sad, and this is the only way out. I love you all very much, but I want to be free. And if freedom means nothingness, then so be it. That's just really powerful last line. And if freedom means nothingness, then so be it. I think it's incumbent on every one of us in this room to do our bit. We all have a role to play in suicide prevention. And we all can make small or large contributions. And we need to all work together. I don't have all the answers. You don't have all the answers. The people with lived experience don't have all the answers. It's all of us coming together, valuing each other independently, respectfully, and us bringing together all our knowledge. We're all experts in this room. And it's only through all of us working together will we stop so many of those notes being written. Thank you.